The building on Oleander Street had stopped being a home sometime in the early 90s. The owner had moved to care for a sister in another state. The lease was never formally broken. It simply expired into silence. No one entered for years. The windows accumulated dust. The mailbox became decorative. By 2004, the building was functionally a coffin with walls. Yet every month, without fail, someone came not to live, not to clean, not to check the property's condition. They came with specific intention. They came at night. They came with objects, and then they left. A neighbor noticed this first, then another, then a postal worker who developed the habit of checking the building's condition, a small ritual of his own. The pattern became undeniable. Once every 30 days, between midnight and 2 in the morning, the front door opened. A figure moved through the dark interior. Roughly 40 minutes later, they departed. This continued for 7 years before anyone thought to investigate. The discovery wasn't dramatic, no crime scene, no hidden body. When the building was finally opened, the neighbor had contacted the property management company out of genuine concern. What they found was methodical, organized, deliberate. Inside the apartment's secondary bedroom, someone had created an altar. It wasn't primitive or hasty. The construction suggested planning, resources, and knowledge. A wooden frame, approximately 4 feet tall, stood against the far wall. The surface held items arranged with geometric precision, candles and brass holders. Their wax accumulated to considerable height, suggesting decades of replacement. A ceramic bowl filled with what appeared to be dried herbs. A framed photograph, face down, never exposed to view. Several handwritten pages in a language none of the discoverers recognized, and objects of unclear purpose, small carved figures. Twisted metal, stones marked with symbols.
It wasn't primitive or hasty. The construction suggested planning, resources, and knowledge. A wooden frame, approximately 4 feet tall, stood against the far wall. The surface held items arranged with geometric precision, candles and brass holders. Their wax accumulated to considerable height, suggesting decades of replacement. A ceramic bowl filled with what appeared to be dried herbs. A framed photograph, face down, never exposed to view. Several handwritten pages in a language none of the discoverers recognized. And objects of unclear purpose, small carved figures. Twisted metal. Stones marked with symbols. The walls surrounding the altar bore marks. Faint marks, barely visible even in daylight. They formed a circle, as if something had been drawn repeatedly, year after year. The chalk or charcoal gradually worn away by time and redrawing. The most telling detail was the calendar.
Pinned to the adjacent wall was a calendar from 1991, the year the apartment was abandoned. Every 30th day was marked. Every single one. The marks continued through the pages until they ran out. Someone had taken photographs. Those photographs showed the calendar continued. Page by page.
This is where the investigation might have ended as an oddity, a mystery solved by assuming religious obsession or mental illness. But the person tending the altar was never found. More confounding, once the apartment was officially sealed and secured, the monthly visits stopped. No attempt was made to break in again. No disturbance occurred. It was as though, once discovered, the ritual simply ceased. The question changed then. It wasn't why is someone doing this anymore. It was what kind of commitment could persist invisibly for that long. The psychological answer isn't what most people assume. There's a phenomenon in behavioral psychology called invisible obligation.
It describes the continuation of actions that have no external reward, no audience, no practical benefit, and no enforcement mechanism. Most humans abandon such behaviors almost immediately. The cost is too high. The reward is non-existent. It makes no rational sense.
Yet some people don't stop. The impulse isn't usually about the space itself. That's the misunderstanding. The apartment wasn't being maintained because the apartment held value.
The apartment had become a vessel for something else entirely. A commitment made under different circumstances. To a different version of oneself that couldn't be abandoned without breaking an internal contract. This happens in countless invisible ways. A woman leaves her childhood home, Her mother dies.
A man promises a dying friend that he'll visit his grave every month. The friend is forgotten by everyone else, but the man arrives, as he has for 23 years, to a cemetery no one else remembers visiting.
These aren't acts of love primarily. They aren't even acts of memory. They're acts of covenant. A person has entered into an agreement with something, a principle, a person, a moment, a version of themselves that transcends logic. To abandon the ritual would be to betray that agreement, which would mean betraying themselves. The altar in the abandoned apartment suggests this dynamic taken to its most concentrated form. The ritual's secrecy is crucial. In the moment someone else knew, the obligation changed. It became performance. It became vulnerable to judgment.
This reveals something particular about how meaning operates in human consciousness. We assume meaning requires witnesses. We assume significance requires validation. But invisible rituals suggest the opposite. Meaning is often strongest precisely because no one else knows. The act becomes pure,
Uncorrupted by interpretation or expectation.
consider the photograph face down on that altar. Whoever maintained the ritual never looked at it. Month after month, they lit the candles, replaced the dried herbs, retraced the circle on the wall. The image was irrelevant. The oath to maintain the ritual in honor of that image was the actual substance.
Yet some people don't stop. The impulse isn't usually about the space itself. That's the misunderstanding. The apartment wasn't being maintained because the apartment held value.
The apartment had become a vessel for something else entirely. A commitment made under different circumstances. To a different version of oneself. That couldn't be abandoned without breaking an internal contract. The broader pattern of invisible rituals reveals that human psychology contains spaces we rarely examine. We're taught to optimize, to seek visible returns, to abandon unprofitable investments.
But entire dimensions of human life operate according to completely different logic. The logic of covenant. The logic of honor. The logic of keeping faith with invisible agreements.
The broader pattern of invisible rituals reveals that human psychology contains spaces we rarely examine. We're taught to optimize, to seek visible returns, to abandon unprofitable investments.
But entire dimensions of human life operate according to completely different logic. The logic of covenant. The logic of honor. The logic of keeping faith with invisible agreements.
It's also worth considering what changed when the ritual was discovered. The obligation didn't suddenly become invalid. The person didn't cease to believe in whatever principle the altar represented. But the ritual itself became impossible to continue. Not because it was literally prevented. The building could theoretically be re-entered.
But because the moment of discovery had fundamentally altered the nature of the act.
In being seen, it became something else. Exposure converted an invisible oath into a potential performance, and a performance is fundamentally different. The moment another person knows, the ritual is contaminated with the possibility of judgment, interpretation, external meaning. It can never be pure again.
Not because the obligation was fulfilled. Not because the belief changed. But because continuation became impossible under the new conditions.
There are probably dozens of invisible altars like this one. Hundreds, maintained in locked buildings, empty houses, sealed rooms that no one will ever enter. People sustaining obligations that have no name, no witnesses, Rituals that will only be discovered after someone dies.
The question that lingers isn't really about the Oleander Street apartment. It's about the nature of invisible commitment itself. What do we owe to our past? To people who've passed? To versions of ourselves we used to be? At what point does obligation?
And at what point does a personal ritual become something indistinguishable from religious faith?
The person who maintained that altar might have been grieving, might have been bound by a promise, might have been practicing a form of magic they believed in, might have simply been honoring the principle that some commitments transcend practicality. The apartment gives us no way to know. And perhaps that's the point.
Perhaps certain acts of devotion are only meaningful if they remain mysteries. To everyone except the person performing them.